Yes, for sure.
For the folks joining us, I apologize. My camera's giving a little bit of a delay, so forgive us any awkward pauses. We'll get through it. You know how it can be with technology.
We'll just practice our wait time.
Exactly. We're teachers. We have that skill, right?
Exactly. Yes, that's what I always need to practice it more.
Exactly. Well, what I'm going to do then, Kathy, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I like to give a little bit of background and context about why we're here, why we're doing these interviews, and then pass the mic over to you. So, I'm Jen from Co-CreatED, and what Co-CreatED is the teacher growth platform. Teacher growth is our thing. We have teacher profiles where teachers can have a professional presence they can share, they can add to over time. We have a free resource shelf for teachers. We have a marketplace full of amazing trainers, just like Kathy, who you're going to hear from today, that teachers can learn from. And we have a coaching tool so that even after training, schools can continue that learning moving forward using our coaching tools. So that's kind of Co-CreatED in a nutshell. And we like to do these interviews just to give school leaders a more inside look at the specialists that we have in our network, such as Kathy and the amazing services they offer. So I'll be interviewing Kathy today the same way in many ways that I would have back when I was a school leader myself and looking to determine, who are the specialists I want to bring into my school. So hopefully principals, there's some value there for you. And I know that I've already learned so much from Kathy and I'm excited for her to share with everybody today. So we will jump into this interview. It'll be a 30-minute one. Does that all sound good with you, Kathy?
Awesome. I'm ready to go.
Perfect. So I'm going to read everyone Kathy's intro. So she is the founder of Wildwood Learning, and she's here to tell us how we can unlock the power of trauma sensitive, strength based learning. So, welcome, Kathy.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks a lot
Yeah.
for having me today. I really appreciate being on this live stream.
Perfect. Well, I'm so glad to have you. And the way I'd like to start, I gave that one liner, but I want to dig into the problem that you are obsessed with solving. I think all of us
Mm,
who are in this line of work, we've found a problem that we're obsessed with solving. What is yours?
Great question, about that problem, that just being obsessed with learning. And what I really see, especially these past few years, it's just gotten to the point where we need to really focus on our school leaders and our staff so that we can do better for our students. I'm just really seeing a lot of places where we can be more focused on our own well-being and then also, recognizing and acknowledging that there's been trauma that's happened not just to our students but trauma that's been happening to our teachers and school leaders, and understanding how that really can affect us, and then integrating these skills that I like to call strength based skills, strength or resiliency skills. So, that problem is what I really see in the workplace is that change in the workplace culture so that we as leaders and teachers and staff can do better because when we feel better, we do better. And when we do better, our students learn better. It's just that whole trickle down effect with everyone. So I'm just really, that's that problem that just really rolls around in my head as to how can I better serve, school leaders and teachers so that they can be the teacher that they want to be or the leader that they want to be.
I love that. And, you know, with every difficulty, right? Like going through the pandemic, we're left with some trauma.
Mhm.
There's no denying that. There's no skirting around that. But on the flip side, and maybe the silver lining, is facing those hardships brings us resilience. And I love that you are focused on flipping that paradigm and shifting our focus from, yes, we were going through trauma, and we now have all this resilience, and we can look at the strengths that we bring to the table, and we can really change the way we're looking at things, right?
Exactly. And when we start talking about trauma and stress, I really focus a lot with toxic stress, especially when we're talking with staff and school leaders. They may think, oh, I didn't do anything that was traumatizing that happened. But we really have had very stressful situations and things happening in our school to the point where it does lead to that toxic stress if we don't employ our skills of resiliency. And, those skills aren't things that come to us naturally. They certainly did not come to me naturally. I had to go through lots of challenges to really figure out what I needed and how I could do my best. And so, as a former school teacher, I know what it's like being in that classroom day in, day out. I still go into classrooms on a weekly basis for a school I serve. So, I'm there. I recognize that it has been extremely hard for our staff and, our school leaders too. We need to take care of them also because they have an awful lot of things going on in their lives too.
That's right. That's right. I was recently at a presentation and learned that teachers have, I want to say, I don't want to quote the percentage because I know I'll get it wrong, but a majorly high percentage higher stress than most other professions. And then on top of that, our school leaders are reporting
Mhm.
even higher stress than our teachers are. And of course, obviously, not that it's a contest, but it's worth remembering we're in the same boat, that it's not like, oh, admin team over here, teacher team over here. It's everybody is experiencing these high levels of stress and higher than other professions. And I'm so glad that people like you are doing the work to acknowledge that, to recognize that, and to bring strategies for that.
Yeah, and I, know just from, being in that school that it's been hard. And now funding and dealing with the lack of a funding source, things have been cut back. So there's just a lot of things on people's plates. And I also know that like with the teaching profession and with being in a school, it's really hard to leave school at the door. I mean, folks say, just walk out of your classroom, go home. But honestly, creating those boundaries is difficult,
That's
super
right.
difficult. So I think too, just kind of figuring out how can we as a school culture create boundaries so that teachers feel like they can also have those boundaries and do things that they need to do to take care of their own well-being and mental health.
Right. It's interesting. I was speaking with a former principal recently about teacher retention. We know that teacher retention is a topic on a lot of school leaders' minds. It's a tough one right now. And obviously, it has to do a
Mhm.
lot with what you're describing, this toxic stress. And I was so interested in this principal's answer because he said that at his school, he did not face that many problems with retention, that he had a high retention rate. So, of course, I asked, how? How did you do it? How did you make that happen?
Right?
And his answer had to do with what you're describing with boundaries. He was like, I'm filtering what's coming down from the district and making sure that not all of that lands on my teachers' plates.
Mhm.
I'm making sure that I'm the buffer so that they don't have to filter through it. I do that for them so that they're not overwhelmed. And then beyond that, having this two-way conversation with my teachers so that I'm checking in about their workload, about their input. And I was like, that's what it takes. It takes the boundaries,
Mhm.
it takes the sifting with common sense, and it takes the two-way conversation.
Exactly. Yeah, and just checking in with people. I know that there's things that sometimes we have to do as teachers that maybe we don't really like to do, but then, just having that check-in. And I really liked what you said, Jen, too, about that we're all in the same boat. I think oftentimes we get that feeling that there's the administration, school leaders, and then there's the teachers, and that there's that line or hierarchy. But I think when school leaders can really emphasize too that we're all in the same boat and I'm here in this boat with you and let's row the same direction, I think you can have like a lot more buy-in to things, a lot more resiliency within your teachers and your staff. And no one wants to have staff quitting in the middle of the year. That just
Mm,
causes you headaches as an administrator. So, what can you do to retain those staff members that are there? Another issue that I see too is I was having a conversation And how many with somebody who was a former teacher, and they had taught for 5 years, and we know the statistics that that's kind of when people decide if they're going to stay in or if they're going to go, and
Mhm.
she decided to go. And my thought is that if this happens over and over and over again, we're not going to have those, seasoned teachers in the classroom to be the mentors for our new ones coming in.
That's right.
Because I know in my teaching career, that's who I turned to when I was having difficulty or was really having a hard day or needed to have some reassurance that, 8th graders don't just, wear you down continuously, that, the next day will be better. And so I think just, all of these things, we need to be proactive. We need to be preventative within our systems so that we can retain those teachers who have been there for years and knows the ropes and can lead those younger ones, mentor them.
Right. I love that. Kathy, were you a middle school teacher?
I was. That was the grades that I loved to teach. I actually started out as a science middle school teacher, taught 6th through 8th grade, and I did some high school. I was in a small school where I did have some biology classes and electives that I did teach. And then after 10 years of being in the classroom, I was offered a part-time position to go into our elementary and do social emotional learning in the elementary classrooms. So that was really where I started to grow those skills of being resilient because I needed to go into the classrooms. And luckily, to teach these skills, and luckily, I had a mentor who was the school social worker. She's the one who actually asked me to come work in the elementary. And she's like, you need to go and teach iMessages to the kids. And I'm like, well, what is an iMessage? I have no idea what an iMessage is. Well, it's how you tell other people how you feel. What? How I feel? I have no idea. I grew up in a family where we really didn't talk about our feelings or our emotions or things like that. It was a huge learning curve for me. And that happened about 19 years ago, but it has been a wonderful job, a wonderful way to influence not just students, but teachers on how important resiliency skills are, how important these skills are. In fact, when I was teaching an iMessage here a few years ago in the classroom, the 3rd grade teacher turned to me and she said, well, I could use this too. And I said, yeah, I use it on my husband all the time. I said, we need to know as adults, and we don't. We
Right.
don't.
Yeah, I was going to say that any of us who, like me, have benefited from therapy at any point have used our I statements or have learned our I statements. That was one of my big takeaways, my I statements, the I feel I needs. Like that is such a key to communication.
Exactly. And we don't learn those things. And I tell the kids when I'm in their classroom how lucky they are because I didn't learn this until I was in my late 30s.
Right. There's no such thing as too early for those skills.
Exactly. And then, for us as adults to really understand too what's really behind those behaviors that maybe are challenging for us in the classroom, understanding about how our brain works. Those are all things that I love to train on. I find them to be fascinating, and I wish I had known this stuff when I was a teacher in those classrooms for 10 years. This was not things that were taught in my teacher training at all. And now we know way more about trauma and the effects of childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences that can then help us to better understand the challenges our students are going through and then find those strategies that can really help build them up and build their resiliency and make school a great place to learn.
So I want to dig into that piece you just mentioned about trauma and how it shows up in schools and just really tap into your expertise a little about, how prevalent is it? How common is trauma showing up in classrooms? And then on the flip side, how common are classrooms that are equipped to be a trauma sensitive environment? Is there a gap between those?
Oh, yes, huge. I believe there is. Before COVID, there were studies that were out about adverse childhood experiences. The study that was done has been out since the mid-90s, so it's not something terribly new, but it is new to maybe the education world as how can we address children who are exposed to those experiences and how the behaviors are like underneath that iceberg, that we have all of these other things going on with kids. We see the top of the iceberg, which is the behaviors that are coming out and what we can do within that classroom to really calm and make it a calm place and helping kids to really focus so that we can work with them. And I know that there is a huge amount of challenging behaviors out there. And post COVID, we're seeing it even more. Every time I go to a workshop or training that I'm doing, I ask a question about what are the challenging behaviors you're seeing. And every teacher can tell me about the challenging behaviors that they've seen escalate. We had a problem probably beforehand. Now it's even showing up more so. And I was just going to mention, Jen, that I come into this work as a parent of four, well, now young adults that are from foster care. We adopted our children from foster care, and this was 18 years ago yesterday. So that was the day that they came into our home. My husband and I, we basically went from, just the two of us to six of us right overnight. And let me tell you that I thought I knew, and I didn't know anything. I had read all the books on parenting, children from hard places, and boy, that was learning. And it just really made me dig in further about how we need to be advocates for kids, how we really need to be that calm, collected, confident adult that can just help kids to co-regulate, help
Right.
them in that classroom. If we're not that, then things just start escalating. If we're not regulated, you're never going to regulate a kid who's like going out of control. And if then that kid gets more dysregulated, then we get more dysregulated. And before it's
So
just, yeah,
true.
we're all
Yeah.
flipping our lids, as Dr. Dan Siegel would say.
Yes. Yes, I remember that. I learned it that way too. I remember the hand, right? And this is the brain, and these are the cortical structures. And
Yep.
when they go offline, flip your lid. You're not able to
Hmm.
be reasoning in that
Yep.
place.
Yep, and I teach kids that too. We talk about the
Yeah,
brain and about flipping our lid and how we can calm ourselves down, and we practice those strategies when I come into the classroom and the teacher's right there with me. So, they're also learning those same skills.
I love that they're learning it side by side. The way that I learned what you're describing, it was called a solid object relationship, like that we have to be kind of the solid object when a child is going through a storm that they can grab hold of to steady themselves. And if we're being reactive and joining in the
Mm,
storm, then we're not that for them. We're not that steady, reliable, non-reactive presence. And it's so important. It's so important.
right. Yeah, and kids have a real great wisdom because in my 6th grade class that I worked with, were talking about what are the things that make our problems bigger and what
Mm.
makes them smaller. And we were listing a number of different skills. And one of the things that the 6th grade class came up with was one of the things that make our problems bigger is when we don't get enough sleep, when we're hungry, all of those self care things.
Yep.
And I thought to myself, it's the same thing for us as adults, right? When we don't take care of ourselves, when we're hungry, when we feel too frazzled and stressed, it makes our problems bigger.
It does. I love
Yeah.
that the kids were able to identify that. It turns out we're all just people. Kids are people, adults are
Right.
people. We have the same like innate stuff going on, right? I love
Exactly.
that
Yep.
example of that conversation of talking with kids about what makes our problems bigger, what makes our problems smaller. I love that framing. Do you have any other just really practical, actionable suggestions for teachers on how they can make their classroom a more trauma sensitive environment, such as that question framework or other things they could try tomorrow? You know, our teachers like it practical.
You bet. Yeah. One of the biggest things is setting some routine in your classroom, which I'm sure a lot of teachers already have. But at the beginning of that routine, some sort of strategy that you can use to help students as they come in and transition to calm down and to focus. So, with younger kids, when they come in from maybe recess, if you've practiced beforehand, just maybe some deep breathing. I have a chime and we ring the chime and we start doing some deep breathing. It's really surprising. The kids that I've worked with years after years, the classrooms, I ring that chime, they right away go into their their belly breathing. So if you can set those things up at the very beginning, and there's so many different ones. And sometimes, kids need to have more of a stretch. And so you can do some stretches, or we have one that's called hot cocoa breathing. I live in northern Minnesota. So, hot cocoa is like a great thing in January, and how we take deep breaths in and then you know, blow it out like we're cooling off the hot cocoa. And then we take a couple sips of our hot cocoa after we do that several times. Now, with high school kids, that might not be the thing, right? They don't really get into that, but helping them to find maybe there's a way that you can do a stretch. Oh, everybody, let's just stand up, do some stretches and lead them in some stretches. Or maybe when the bell rings, I don't know if they have their phones in their classroom, but if they do, put their phone down and just have them focus on something on their desk. Maybe their phone's on their desk and they're just focusing on the back of it, right? Not on the front so that you're reading it, but on the back of it so you don't see the notifications coming up. And that really is hard for high school students at times, just taking that phone and physically putting it on their desk and not having it in their hand. And that makes a great
Wow.
conversation too. What are you
Yeah.
feeling? Having them kind of tap into those feelings that are happening, and why. It
And
can lead to a great conversation.
yeah, definitely. I think for our high schoolers too, kind of pulling back the curtain and talking about the brain, helping them understand how their own body works. Like, we're not going to make a game of it. We're going to give you the behind the scenes real deal. I think high schoolers can
Mhm.
respect that. You know, they want the, okay, all right, you're trying to talk to me about some real stuff. Like, this isn't some woo woo. This is how brains work, and this is what you can do for yours.
Yeah, and as a former science teacher, I love doing that with high school students and high school teachers, because I think then they can also help the students to bring in some skills. Okay, so before your test, right? Your brain might be feeling like it's kind of here, and we know that when you're starting to get a little bit up here, that we have to do something, or else, it'll go a whole lot better. So helping them to really recognize, when are you feeling like you're getting into that heightened stage, and what can you do to bring that down so that you can be more focused and calm. And I know another gal was telling me that she had noticed this with a special ed teacher. She was working in a school, and when the kids came into the classroom, she did like a regulating activity, just took less than a minute or 2, and she had asked the teacher afterwards, "Why did you do that?" And she said, "Well, I know that if I didn't take a minute or 2 to help them get regulated, that they would be all over the place." And just taking those couple minutes to help them to regulate, it went so much smoother.
Right.
They
And
were
so,
focused.
we're always trying to draw this through line from teacher training, development, preparation, down to teacher practices. Like, if I'm going to take this training, what's the change in practice that's going to come after? And then continuing that line from
Mhm,
practices to outcomes, student outcomes. And so, in that example you just gave, what I'm hearing is like, instead of the teacher just taking this really traditional approach and sticking to the content, she took a moment and made a change in practice, which is, I'm going to do regulation first because that's how humans work. We have to regulate to be ready to learn.
mhm,
And that change in practice is going to result
mm.
in much better student outcomes, right? Like, those kids are going to do a lot better on their math test because they regulated before the math lesson, right?
Exactly, and it takes her, what, a couple minutes, and it takes a practice of it because you don't wanna do it just before a test. You want them to know these things before the test on how they can then help themselves or
That's right.
before the assignment. Or what I like to bring into high schools too is how actors and performers and people who are in the sports
Right.
realm, how they do this too so that they don't think that this is just some woo woo thing and that, oh, we only do it in our science class or our math class or before a test. You know, these are things that professional athletes do,
Right.
that professional performers do before their big events.
Yeah. So, Kathy, if a school wanted to book you to come help teachers make these changes in practice and learn these strategies for regulation and becoming more trauma sensitive, and we haven't even really touched on the strength based part, what are some of the packages you offer and how could they book those with you?
Yeah. So the first thing that I really like to do is have a conversation with a school leader because I really need to figure out where is that school at and what they really are looking for within their staff and their school changes. I think that one-off workshops aren't the way to go. We all know that we need to have like this continuous support. That's why I love Co-Created and having that coaching afterwards and things like that. So I always like to start off with having the basics of being trauma informed. What does that mean? How does the neurobiology work? We didn't even touch on what epigenetics is, which is intergenerational trauma, also looking at resilience and the ACEs study. So just having that basis is where I really like to start off with a lot of schools because even when we think that maybe we're trauma informed, it's always good to hear it over again. And our staff is changing. You maybe had a trauma informed presentation 2 years ago, and then now you've had multiple staff changeover. So that information is missing. And then going into those things that we can then bring into our classroom and bring into our own lives so that we can do better for our students and increase their learning. So working with me starts with a conversation.
It's a good starting point. We always like to lead with listening, right? That's our good leadership practice. And I love to the continued support that you offer. It's we start with a conversation, we get a baseline, we build some knowledge, then we go into the practical application and you give that continued support through that continuum. I think that's a really effective approach. And I'm glad that you called out the one off workshop has got to go. We've got to let go of that. It's not the way adult learning works. It's about these continued relationships and this customized support. So I love hearing that that's what you have to offer.
Yes, and when you talk about strengths too, I love that too. That's all part of it. And maybe that's a whole nother conversation, Jen.
I know, who knew? Like in 30 minutes, it's I thought we would cover so much, but I always do appreciate the depth and I appreciate also the personal stories you brought to the table. And thank you for sharing those, like your experience as a parent and your experience as a teacher. I think there's no place I like to learn more than within a person's story. So I appreciate you sharing pieces of yours. And I love this conversation today, Kathy. I really do appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on the Co-Created channel and being part of the Co-Created network. I think you're really onto something here.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, we love having you in our network. And I think to follow up this episode, what I'm going to do is make sure folks know where to find you, where to follow you, and continue that relationship with you. And then, Kathy, I'm going to ask you after this, not to put you on the spot, whether you have any kind of freebies that you give away for teachers, because our teachers do love getting a little freebie after these. So, as we wrap up, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. And Kathy, if you'll hang around with me, we will talk about those follow up steps. So, thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks. We'll see you. Thanks, Jen.
All right. Thanks, y'all.